You know that monster from Stranger Things, the Demogorgon? Creepy, slimy, straight out of a nightmare? Well, according to some people, it wasn't just made up from TV. See, Stranger Things was originally going to be called Montauk, based on a real conspiracy theory out of Long Island, New York. And the stories from this place sound like a Netflix script that got out of hand. Psychic kids, secret government experiments, time travel, and yeah, even a monster breaking loose in an underground base. The legend is called the Montauk Project, and it's one of those tales that blurs the line between Cold War paranoia and straight up sci fi horror. So today, on Not Smart Just Curious, we're going to look at the wild story that may have inspired Stranger Things and asking, was Camp Hero just another military base? Or was it hiding something darker in its tunnels? Now, before we get into the monsters and the time-traveling chairs, let's back up for a second. Because to understand why people believe all this, you gotta know about the place where it supposedly went down. Camp Hero. At the very edge of Long Island, past the beaches and the lobster shacks, sits this place called Camp Hero. Built during World War II and then later updated for the Cold War. It had one big job: to watch the skies. The Montauk radar dish, the giant satellite-looking thing, it was part of a system of 12 bases across the U.S., all meant to give early warning if the Soviets launched missiles at us. Out of all of them, Montauk is the only one still standing. Now, officially, Camp Hero shut down in 1981. The story is, thanks for your service, but we're done here. Everyone go home. But locals weren't buying it. People living nearby swore they still saw activity years later. Guards patrolling, unmarked cars, even helicopters chasing off these curious kids. And then you've got the urban explorers. In the 90s, a guy named Brian Minnick and his friends started sneaking into the abandoned base with cameras. And what they found didn't line up with the closed in 81 story at all. They found receipts for tens of thousands of dollars worth of food dated from the late 80s, not the early 80s when it supposedly shut down. Hallways sealed off with heavy doors. There were these rumors of these LSD experiment rooms, which Brian claimed they found. Brian's footage even showed underground tunnels, which the government insists don't exist. All right, so how do you go from Cold War radar base to time travel and monsters? Well, the story really kicks off with another legend, the Philadelphia experiment. Now, if you're not familiar with it, back in 1943, the Navy was desperate. German U-boats were tearing through Allied ships in the Atlantic, and radar was becoming the new superweapon of the war. If you could avoid detection, you could win. So the Navy supposedly tried a wild experiment. They loaded up the USS Eldridge with these giant generators and coils, all designed to bend electromagnetic fields around the ship. Not just to make it invisible to radar, but to make it vanish altogether. And that's exactly what happened. On October 28th, 1943, the Eldridge was docked at Philadelphia when it was suddenly engulfed in a strange green fog. Witnesses claimed the entire ship shimmered, then disappeared. Some say it reappeared in Virginia, 200 miles away, before blinking back to Philadelphia. Others claimed the ship slipped not just through space, but also through time. Now, the aftermath, pure nightmare fuel. Sailors said that they felt sick, disoriented, and a few supposedly fused right back into the ship. Others vanished completely. And out of all this chaos come two names you'll hear a lot in this lore tale: Al Bellick and Duncan Cameron. Now, according to Bellick, he and Cameron were on the Eldridge that day. When things went sideways, they panicked. They ran up to the deck and they jumped overboard. But instead of hitting the Delaware River, they hit something else entirely. Bellick said the moment they leapt was like falling through electricity itself. The ocean vanished and they tumbled through a tunnel of light and energy. When they landed, it wasn't water beneath them. It was solid ground. The year, he claimed, was no longer 1943, it was 1983. And instead of in Philadelphia, they were in some strange underground facility buzzing with equipment and scientists. The very heart of what they later learned was the Montauk Project. From here, it starts getting a little bit weird. Bellick described meeting men who told him that the Philadelphia experiment 40 years prior ripped open a wormhole, a tear in space and time. And that hole was still open. Camp Hero, decades later, was supposedly using that same technology to keep the rift stable, to study it, and even weaponize it. He claimed he and Duncan weren't just stranded there. They were pulled into the project, tested, experimented on, and apparently they even used to time travel back and forth through these so-called time tunnels. Now, I know Bellick and Cameron's story sounds like a sci-fi movie, but other people claim that these experiments didn't just involve these grown men from a Navy ship, but that they targeted kids. And that's where the Montauk legend starts sounding a whole lot like Stranger Things. So let's start with our two time travelers from the Eldridge, Al Bellick and Duncan Cameron. After landing at Camp Hero in 1983, they said they were immediately pulled into something out of science fiction. Scientists put them through tests in something called the Montauk Chair, a contraption that looked like a cross between a dentist's nightmare and a sci-fi throne. It was wired with coils, sensors to supposedly boost psychic energy, and Duncan was said to be especially powerful in the chair. His thoughts could flash onto a computer screen, form into holograms, and become solid matter. Kind of like Stranger Things, except cranked to 11. And it didn't stop there, because Bellick claimed that Duncan could even open a vortex in space-time using the Montauk's massive radar antenna. Now, if Bellick and Cameron were the guinea pigs, then it's going to be Preston Nichols, who cast himself as the engineer, basically the man behind the curtain. Now, when I was researching for this video, I watched a couple interviews with Preston Nichols, and to be honest, the dude came across as half nut job, half college professor, full mad scientist. In his home, he built what he called a radionic machine. It's basically this wall of thrift-stored radios, vacuum tubes, all wired together. But when Nichols started explaining it, your head starts turning a little bit. In the interview, he was quoted saying that I can put my thought through the sound system into the tubes and reach out on a quantum level to do things, so to speak. So yeah, at first glance, this guy might seem like a bit of a kook. But here's the twist. Nichols had degrees in psychology and electrical engineering. And when you listen to him explain complex scientific theories and ideas, it starts to get pretty darn convincing. But hey, I'm not smart. I'm just curious. Nichols was one of the most vocal proponents of psychotronics, the idea that electromagnetic fields or frequencies could influence human thought. Psychotronics had been studied and explored by the Soviet researchers during the Cold War, but Nichols claimed that in the US, the experiments went much further, into direct mind control. Now, through his research, Nichols claimed that he had recovered suppressed memories of working inside of Camp Hero, building the Montauk Chair, running experiments, and even witnessing kids being programmed. And that's when in 1992, he dropped a bombshell. He released the book, The Montauk Project, Experiments in Time. It laid out everything: time travel, psychic warfare, mind control, even the Philadelphia experiment connection. Now, you can still go on YouTube and find some of Nichols' lectures today, where he even dives into what he called the Phoenix experiments. So, if Nichols was the brain of Montauk, then the so-called Montauk Boys were its victims. So, who are the Montauk Boys, and what is a Montauk Boy? That's the name given to the kids who were supposedly taken into the Camp Hero experiments. The story goes like this. During the 1970s and early 80s, children, teenagers, they were kidnapped and brought to the underground labs at Montauk. Once there, they were drugged, tortured, and programmed. The idea? Break the mind and rebuild it into a sleeper agent. Over the years, a handful of men have stepped forward with their stories. The pattern is always the same: LSD, breaking minds, rebuilding obedience. Now, one of the first voices you'll hear is a man that goes by the name of James Bruce. He says when he was a teenager, researchers forced him to take LSD inside what locals now call acid houses. He claimed that the drugs made the kids easier to program. He also talked about what he called synced minds. Researchers experimented with giving kids different mixes of LSDs. Each dose was supposed to lock their brains onto the same frequency. Once in sync, the kids could supposedly hear each other's thoughts without even speaking, like their minds were wired together. And then there's Stuart Swerdlow. He's probably the most public Montauk boy. His story has been told many times. He says that he was taken as a teenager in the late 70s and pushed through a brutal program. Torture, near drownings, electric shocks, starvation, overfeeding, and all-around programming. Now, another man, Joe Lafreno, came forward decades later. He worked as a Long Island Parks employee. And underneath hypnosis, he says that memories started to come back. He remembered being taken as a teenager, led into a sunken house. He said he was wired to electrodes and surrounded by dozens of other kids. And his words are haunting. We were just little kids. It was a very dark, very evil thing. Now, across these stories, the details repeat. LSD dosing in acid houses, kids strapped to the Montauk chair to amplify their psychic powers, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, and at the end of all of it, making psychic soldiers. All right, now that we've met the people, let's look at the weird machines they said made Montauk so dangerous. Now, we've already mentioned it, but let's give the Montauk chair its own spotlight. Imagine a recliner wired up with coils, sensors, and what felt like a sci-fi control panel. It didn't detect psychic ability, but it amplified it. Duncan Cameron, the time traveler from earlier, was the favorite guinea pig because his abilities would make him significantly stronger than any other of the test subjects. His thoughts would be projected onto a screen where scientists would study. These thoughts eventually turned into holograms, and they eventually turned them into solid objects. The chair also plays a central role in the escape legend. Some says Duncan triggered a contingency plan, but we'll get to that in a bit. Nicholas claimed that with just a lock of hair, or even a personal object, subjects could tap into a machine that let them see through someone else's eyes, hear through their ears, and even feel what they're feeling. It's creepy. It's invasive. And it's familiar, because if you watch Stranger Things, you'll remember how Eleven used a blindfold and a sensory tank to slip into other people's heads. This was like a Cold War version of that, only without the warm bathwater and the Christmas lights. And then there's the big one, the massive radar antenna at Camp Hero. Officially, it was part of the Sage defense system, designed during the Cold War to track incoming Soviet bombers. From a distance, it just looks like a giant steel dish looming over the trees. But to locals, it wasn't just watching the skies. It was messing with their heads. Whistleblowers and residents claimed that the tower doubled as a psychic amplifier. Every time it rotated, they said strange things would happen. Animals would suddenly drop dead in the woods. Flocks of birds would plummet out of the sky. People nearby reported crushing headaches, spontaneous nosebleeds, and even slipping into trance-like states as if their brains were being scrambled by invisible waves. The tower still stands today, rusted, fenced off, and silent. Okay, so far we've heard about psychic kids, LSD rooms, and radar towers that could bend reality. But according to some, the Montauk Project didn't just create sleeper agents. It unleashed something much worse. By the early 1980s, Camp Hero's experiments had hit a breaking point. And at the center of it all was Cameron Duncan. Yeah, the same guy who jumped off the boat. Strapped into the Montauk chair, Duncan's abilities were said to have gone way beyond what the scientists expected. He wasn't just projecting images anymore. He could manifest real objects. The story goes that in one final test, Duncan was told to let his subconscious mind run wild. No limits, no restraints. They started the experiment, and then during peak power, Cameron suddenly started acting weird. He sat up, leaned forward out of the chair, and whispered 4 words. The time is now. Moments later, a massive vortex ripped open inside the facility, and then something came out. Now, the descriptions do differ, but most accounts say that it stood at least 10 feet tall, hairy, hulky, and all around savage. Some called it a nightmare pulled straight out of Duncan's subconscious. Others swore it was an interdimensional creature that slipped through the rift. Whatever it was, it tore through Camp Hero, smashing equipment, attacking personnel, and killing anyone unlucky enough to be in its path. The only way to stop it, they said, was to cut the power to the radar antenna and seal the underground levels with concrete. After the so-called Montauk Monster incident, the project was supposedly abandoned for good. The base was shut down, the tunnel sealed, and the official line was clear. Nothing unusual had ever happened at Camp Hero. But to believers, the monster was just the smoking gun. Proof that Montauk wasn't just messing with psychic research. Now take all that, put it next to Stranger Things, a secret lab, psychic kids, portals, a creature from another dimension. The resemblance, it's hard to ignore. Today, Camp Hero isn't a secret lab. It's a public state park. With forests, wetlands, dramatic ocean cliffs, it's a favorite for hikers, bird watchers. The radar tower still stands, and its brutal Cold War vibe is fully intact. The guy behind the Montauk Chronicles wasn't content with just retelling the legend. He actually brought in a professional geophysicist to scan beneath the surface of Camp Hero. And what they found was strange. Readings suggested that there were unmapped tunnels and hollow chambers underground, spaces that do not appear on any official blueprints. To believers, this sounded like confirmation of what locals and explorers like Brian Minnick had been saying for years. Now remember, Brian's footage showed sealed off hallways and hints of tunnels that weren't supposed to exist. Montauk thrives on mystery. We've seen it echoed in pop culture too. Stranger Things was originally going to be called Montauk. And just recently, The Institute was released. And if you haven't watched that, do it. Movies, podcasts, documentaries, they all keep asking the same question. Was any of it real? Whether you believe the Montauk Project was real or just one of the wildest urban legends in American history, the story refuses to die. On one hand, we've got whispers of kidnapped kids, a psychic chair, portals to other dimensions, and even a monster tearing through a government lab. And then we've got the official story that none of this ever happened, and that Camp Hero is just a Cold War relic. It lives in that tension between what we're told and what might still be hiding in the shadows. And that gap is exactly where I like to stay. So, next time you're watching 11 in the lab, fighting off creatures from other dimensions, just know that all of that was inspired by this very legend. So what do you guys think? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into weird history, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.